Session. Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in this very interesting session on API authorization. I'm Andre Karlström and I'll be your host for today. I'm with the Axiomatics team and we have a webinar packed with interesting stuff for you. We'll be talking about the API landscape and how to secure your data with a much richer and more dynamic approach. So let me introduce today's speakers. From Axiomatics, we have David Broussard, who is the VP of Customer Relations, as you can see. He has a background in service-oriented architecture and brings over 10 years of experience in security for web apps, services, and APIs. And we also have a special, very special, let me say, guest with us here today. It's Anderson Gray. He's an advisor at CA Technologies, and he currently works with clients across public sectors in all area of their API management business challenges. He has over 25 years of experience in the IT industry, so he brings a lot of experience to the table, and we're really happy to have him with us here today for this session. With that, I'll turn you over to these two guys and they'll guide us through this very interesting session. So over to you guys.
Thanks, Andre. Anyway, hi, Andy. How you doing?
Good. Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with what is an API or an API, how they came about, what they are, how they're used, and we're going to go into a financial services sort of mobile financial services use case, and then go into what you need to think about when you're dealing with APIs. And so the first place to start is what is an API? And we here at CA, we've got an API Academy, guys that go out and work with customers all across the U.S. and in the world, really, and ask them or educate them about APIs. And when we do these sessions, we kind of ask them, what is an API? What have you heard? And so these are some of the things we get from our feedback when we're talking with customers that are out there. And people say it's a communications channel. It's a product. You know, CA's got a product called API Management, so they might have heard of that. It's a platform. You'll hear there's an API platform. There's cloud vendors that are producing API platforms. They're deployed on the World Wide Web. They use HTTP, including SOAP. It's a REST interface, or it's not a SOAP interface. It's not a web service. And so these are some of the common things we hear when we're out there. And these are really more about describing what an API does, or the attributes about an API. So to start with, let's go right to the beginning and say, to get some clarity on this, let's say, what is an API? Let's define it. Let's show what its purpose is and its value. And then we'll add upon that use case to bring you up to speed with ways that people are using APIs today. So the definition is pretty straightforward. It's nothing new from the early 80s, probably back as far as 70s and 80s when APIs were created to communicate for application programming interface for applications to interface with other applications. The only difference now is that when I show this integration here between two applications, where I'm doing a get for weather, and the response is this bit of information here, New York City, and the temperature of 72. It's just two applications talking together using this API. The thing that it's kind of understood when you're looking at this is that the previous APIs were proprietary protocols and proprietary data formats. But what you're looking at here in the simple API is kind of open protocols and open formats, where you've got HTTP with the get, with the weather, and then the response to the API call is a JSON data type that will give you the city and the temperature. So that's the way the API, the application program interface, has kind of changed currently. And so the purpose for APIs then is just to allow applications to communicate. So it's application communication. Still, again, nothing new. We got two servers here that are talking. One was querying about the weather of New York City, and it got the current temperature. And then what are the values now of APIs? So when you create APIs, it allows you to create new applications. If you're creating new applications, you're potentially creating new revenue streams based upon your applications, and new businesses, new ways of looking at the information you have and exposing those to other businesses. And this is the last two there are the really important ones that we're probably going to focus on here. And so if APIs have been around since the 80s or 90s, and the only thing we really changed is we moved to open protocols and open data formats, what's the real impetus here? Why now? Why are we so interested in APIs nowadays? Mobile device explosion is one of those. So the mobile device explosion, the mobile apps, the number of apps, the number of people using apps, not just to get weather, but to do real business function, has exploded. There's an increased demand for connectedness. So along with mobile devices or tablets or agencies or partners needing to connect in the supply chain, it's an easy way to connect your applications together. And there's also increased competition. So why now? It's really interesting on the mobile piece of this. So we're going to dig down into the mobile application part of this and why APIs make sense in the mobile world and what's the real big push here. And we're going to go through the simple use case that probably everybody has seen or done today, probably 2 or 3 times a day. I know where I am on the East Coast of the U.S. I've checked the weather forecast multiple times because it's raining pretty hard. It's supposed to rain for the next few days. So when we do this mobile app experience and we're looking at APIs, we then look at how the mobile experience was created. So here is my query for my mobile application that's going to give me a view of the weather forecast here for London. So we lay out the graphics in text. We have a temperature, data by location, and there's user input. And so the APIs will help us deconstruct what we're seeing here based upon what you would have previously done in, say, a web browser on your desktop. And I'll go through the differences here. So if we took the backend server and we've got temperature data by location and layouts and graphics, and we build a page like you build a web page, and then we take the front end, we're going to pass that view out to the front end client, which is a mobile device, and then on the mobile front end, the user is going to input the location they're looking for. So this is taking your existing web application and mobilizing it. And so it works. We've passed through this period of doing this, I don't know, in the mid to late 2000s, early this decade. And this was a common way of getting mobile applications or web applications out to the mobile devices. Not really API enabled. And so if you want to look at taking this approach and creating an API out of it, what will we need to do? So to power the mobile UI with an API, we need to create an API that allows you to search for temperature by location. So it's as simple as that. So now I've reduced my development effort down to just creating APIs, making them nice and clean. And then it allows the front end to deal with what it's going to look like on the actual device. So if it's an iPad or an iPhone or Android, they can lay out the text and graphics and give the user input. Not much has changed. The actual mobile app looks very similar, but now it's making an API call. And what's the difference here? Why is this new? What's the revelation here? The revelation is if I want to move to different form factors, Internet of Things, cars, tablets, refrigerators, home AC units or thermostats. I can do that because they can all make the same API call and deal with their layouts and their view of that data differently. So I've gone from a static page displayed out and created for my iPhone over to making it easy to be consumed by multiple devices. So this is where the mobile, or Internet of Things as well, has really pushed APIs. And when you do this and you're exposing your data now to multiple ways of coming in, you're also creating, and this dotted line here in the middle is probably the boundary of your enterprise to all the things coming and calling your API. You're probably opening yourself up to a little bit of a security threat. So that's been the main piece that's been holding people back from going full bore into APIs. How do I secure these? How do I know who's coming in? How do I make sure that my APIs don't overrun my backend in terms of now I've got 17 different things or 100 different things making calls to my API. Do I have enough resources to support that? So that's where the whole API management space comes in. And so what we do is we take the same view of the world where we have n number of devices. We're going with the mobile Internet of Things use cases here. And we add in an API gateway, like the CA API gateway. So now all of these API calls are coming into a gateway. And that gateway is securing the actual APIs that are behind it. So it allows for security. So who's making the calls? Are those applications vetted to make these API calls? Do they have API keys? Those sort of things. Are they making the requests in the right within the right usage? You know, can we enforce some usage characteristics so that I don't overrun my backend? So all we've done here is we've added a nice facade or interface pattern in front of our APIs to expose those. And again, we've gotten from dealing with the specific UI aspects of the mobile world, creating clean APIs where people can query, ask, submit information, and get that back. Oh, sorry. So here's some of the benefits. I forgot to click through there. You've got the management of the APIs. You got traffic management, SLA management, message validity, and identity federation. So those are some of the benefits here of putting a gateway solution in front of your API. And so if you look at the financial services industry in terms of APIs in the mobile space specifically. So here I've got some screenshots of my Wells Fargo mobile application. And the cool thing there that has happened with the advent of APIs and the advent of mobile at the same time, or mobile applications, is I've got this capability now to do something that I was not able to do before. So on my mobile device, I can deposit checks instead of driving over to the bank. I can deposit multiple of those. And so here it shows that in action, where I've got a mobile deposit going on, so the mobile application. So the APIs are exposed from Wells Fargo. I load up the mobile application. I log in with my credentials. It goes through the characteristics that are associated with Andy Gray and his banking relationship he has with Wells Fargo. And it'll have like deposit limits and days. It'll list all of my accounts, what I can and cannot do with each one of those accounts. And so all of that is happening via an API. So I logged in, I clicked on mobile deposit. It came in, hit the API for mobile deposit. The gateway went ahead, after it authenticated me, it went ahead to a policy decision point or an authorization server and queried it for what I can do, what this user or this identity can do on this given API. And so that when it'll show me back my accounts, it'll show me back my thresholds that are associated with that. And so then when I submit this mobile deposit, it comes into the gateway. We again check it does the vetting of, is it really a check? Do the dates match up? The dates and values match up? Then go ahead back again and make sure that I'm making all these things from an authorization perspective as well. And so an API gateway allows you to expose your APIs securely, authenticate, validate, and then integrate in with some of these other technologies that exist out there in terms of authorizing attribute-based access control on your APIs and the identity access management systems to authenticate those users as well. And so this is a real-world, simplified view of how APIs have been used in real-world mobile financial services transactions, protected by gateways, so that they're secure and authenticated, and then integrated in with authorization servers, identity servers, and the actual APIs that are exposed.
Thanks, Anderson, for a great presentation on APIs. And now in the second part of the webinar, I'm going to focus on ABAC. So in the title of the webinar, we had two acronyms. We love acronyms at Axiomatics. The first one was API, and thanks, Andy, for the overview of why APIs matter and how they have evolved over time from the 1970s or 1980s concept of just the interface to ways of delivering new content and new services to different platforms, and in particular, lately, mobile. Out of curiosity, Andy, when you do APIs these days with customers, how much of those are for mobile use cases?
I would say probably we're seeing probably over 60 to 70% of our customers are focused in on the mobile use case nowadays.
Wow, that's huge, because I remember when you and I met for the first time years back, it was all about services-oriented architecture, and mobile did not even exist back then.
Correct. Yeah, it has changed in the last 2 to 3 years pretty significantly with our customer base.
That's great, and we're seeing the same pattern with our customers here, where they want to use different channels, they want to use different devices in different contexts. And that's where ABAC, or attribute-based access control, fits in extremely well. So as you know, of course, Axiomatics is the leading provider of dynamic and policy-based authorization using attributes. And what that means more specifically is that if you look at the history of access control, typically we focused on the user, on the identity, on who the user is and what their role is. If you're a customer, you can do function XYZ. If you're a manager, you can do function ABC, so on. It was very much about the user identity. It was very much about the user's role and the permissions linked with that role. So that was role-based access control, a model defined in 1992 by NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology. But as the world evolved, as the number of applications has gone up through the roof, not just mobile applications, but services and applications throughout the enterprise, as the amount of information we're dealing with has grown massively, just granting access based on the role of a user was not enough. Instead, we realized that we needed to consider more parameters than just who the user is. And we like to summarize that by saying you've got to think about the 5 W's in the H. Who can access the information? What information can they access? If we go back to the example you were using, Andy, who can access the mobile banking app? Well, it would be the customer. What information can they access? Can they view the balance of the bank account? Can they view the checks that have been deposited online? But also, we want to include contextual information. When can they access information? Is it valid for a customer to check their balance at 2 in the morning from a country which is not a country where they're typically located? And that takes me to the next W, the where. Where can they access the information from? And how, from which device? Is it a mobile device? Is it a corporate device? Or are they using VPN? And finally, why? For what reason? What is the purpose of use? The why matters a lot in environments such as financial services, healthcare services, but also the intelligence community and the defense community. The purpose of use and the reason matter. So at a very high level, what is attribute access control? Well, it's an evolution from role-based access control where instead of just using roles and groups and permissions, we describe everything in terms of attributes. And attributes are just key value pairs. For instance, age is equal to 18, location is equal to Vancouver, date is equal to the 1st of October, so on and so forth. And in ABAC, there's no limit to how many attributes you can use. You can use as many attributes as you like, so long as you can find a value for that attribute. ABAC also enables what we like to call externalized authorization, meaning that instead of implementing thick authorization logic within your different applications and layers, we're going to extract that authorization, centralize it, and manage it in that central location, and then enforce it where it matters. And this is where the API gateway comes in. It acts as the enforcement point, the enforcer of that externalized authorization logic. The logic is also expressed as policies. That's a huge advance compared to past authorization models where typically you would express authorization logic either as assignments or as code. And that meant it was extremely hard to express advanced authorization scenarios on the one hand, but also extremely hard to run audit reports. If you wanted to know what a user could do, you would have to go through each and every application, understand the code, understand the logic, and then write a lengthy report, and that could take days on end. Those policies are written in a standard called XACML, XACML. It's the standard that implements ABAC today. You can find more about XACML on the OASIS website. The policies are managed centrally in that central location, so it means that if you want to change your authorization logic, you've only got one place to go, that central point of management. Before we move on, I really recommend that attendees turn to the NIST website. They have great publications on ABAC and on XACML that describe how you want to best use attribute-based access control, what are the challenges, and what are it's a great read if you want to get started. Now, if we look at the architecture of ABAC, it will look very similar to what Andy presented in his slides when he had the API gateway protecting the backend services. Here we've got a user Bob, and user Bob wants to use an application, a black box. And that application could be an API, a web service, a traditional application, an off-the-shelf application. It could be pretty much anything you like. And what we're going to do is when the user sends a business request to that application, we're going to have a policy enforcement point in the middle, the traffic light here. That enforcement point will convert the business request into an authorization request. In this example, can Bob access record number 22? That authorization request is expressed in a standard way, in a XACML way. It's sent off to the authorization service or the policy decision point. I think, Andy, you had the acronym PDP in the top right corner, so this is the authorization service. The authorization service is configured with those policies, those centrally managed policies. You can have as many as you like, and they can cater to as many scenarios as you like. In addition, the authorization service is configured with external sources of attributes. So if you need more information about Bob, for instance, Bob's citizenship, his date of birth, his clearance code, you can fetch that from an external source of attributes, for instance, an Active Directory, an LDAP, or other sources. You could also retrieve information about the records the Bob is trying to access. Record 22, for instance, what is its classification, what department it belongs to, so on and so forth. With those policies and with the additional attributes fetched from those data sources, the authorization service can reach a conclusion as to whether access should be granted, and it returns that decision back to the policy enforcement point, either a permit or a deny. If it's a permit, the business request goes through. If it's a deny, then the request is bounced back to the user. And what's great with ABAC is that the way to ask for an authorization decision has been standardized. So developers, when building their apps and their APIs, they don't have to think about how it works. It's a simple yes/no question. You send off the question, you get the response back, you implement the decision in your enforcement point in an API gateway, for instance, and you can just carry on. ABAC enables what I like to call the any-depth architecture, meaning that you can enforce your decision where it matters most. So you can go all the way from your presentation tier to the web access management tier, for instance, CA SiteMinder, to the web app, web service, and API tier, all the way down to the business tier, and finally even at the data tier. What matters is that depending on the layer you are intercepting at, the form factor of the enforcement point will be different. For instance, if you want to intercept at the data tier, there's a dedicated solution for that that does data filtering. If you want to intercept at the web app level, you would integrate, for instance, with Spring Security. And in particular, for today's topic, in the API tier, you would integrate with the CA API gateway, which will act as the policy enforcement point. So a quick word on an API-driven architecture. The way I see it when I talk to my customers, adding on to what you said, Andy, is that an API-driven architecture is really an agile architecture. It's really about decoupling all those apps and services and modules that were once glued together in very heavy legacy applications in the back end of an enterprise. It's really trying to break up all that functionality, a bit like Lego blocks. And what it means is that it makes it easier to offer new services. It makes it easier to expose more data. It also, like you said, it enables mobile scenarios. 60 to 70% of the scenarios you see are now mobile scenarios. At the same time, like you pointed out, the fact that you open up to the greater world and the fact that you enable so much connectivity and interchange creates a lot of challenges. So you need to make sure that you can protect your APIs in a secure way. And that involves, of course, authentication, encryption, threat protection, which is what the API gateway will handle for us, but also there's a need for much finer-grained authorization. A user identity, a user role is no longer enough. We need more. We need to take into account risk, context, the content of the message, and that's where APIs are going to be such a great help, because they expose the content of what's being exchanged between the client and the backend, the service. In other words, to summarize that, what we really need for the agile architecture is an agile authorization framework, and that's where ABAC steps in. Now, when you bring together, on the one hand, the CA API gateway and the Axiomatics policy server, what you end up with is a policy-driven approach. The API gateway is configured using declarative policies that dictate the different steps you have to take your API messages through, encryption, decryption, authentication, so on and so forth. But at the same time, you also use the authorization policies within the Axiomatics policy server. And that's great, because now you have two policies, one that focuses on message security and routing, and the other one that focuses on the fine-grained authorization. It also means that it's extremely easy to configure, reconfigure, and adapt the solution to your different APIs as they grow over time. I stole your slide, Andy. I thought it was a great slide. So here we have the financial application again. On the left-hand side, the mobile app, and on the right-hand side, we have the backend. And you were mentioning on your slide that the API gateway will handle the authentication, and I'm sure you can handle different forms of authentication, message validity, as well as deauthorization. And that's where the Axiomatics policy server will fit in, because it will be able to take the attributes that the API gateway sends to the policy server in order to make a decision. And that's actually the neat thing about this integration. The API gateway can inspect the messages that flow through the gateway in a very detailed way, extract different parts of those messages, use them as attributes, as building blocks to the authorization request, send it off to the policy server, wait for the response, get the response back, and enforce that response. And you can even actually go down different paths when you enforce the response. If it's a permit, you might want to go down the allowed path. If it's a deny, you might want to go down the deny path, or maybe an exception path, so on and so forth. So you have a lot of flexibility. And as a matter of fact, you can call out to the authorization service on the way in, when the message goes from the client to the backend, but also on the way back. And what that means is that you can actually filter information when it comes back, and you can even mask or redact information inside those messages. I had a great use case out in Illinois a few years back of an insurance company that wanted to exchange insurance records that were expressed as XML documents. Now, the CA API gateway is great at processing XML, so it could actually take decisions from the Axiomatics policy server, and whether it was a permit or a deny, it could actually decide to redact XML elements within that insurance document, and then eventually pass on the document, the redacted document, to the requester, to the client. Now, to wrap up the webinar, I want to talk about an insurance use case. Some of the main use cases we see for ABAC, for attribute-based access control, are within financial services and within the health and insurance verticals. So here's an example of a sample API. This is a REST-based API where you expose your data via that REST API. In this case here, I'm exposing a patient's journal and a patient's medical record. You can see that in the URI, I have a variable, the patient ID. So that's something the API gateway can understand, extract, and pass on to the policy server for decision making. You can see also that I have a record ID in the URL, and again, that's something you can extract from the URL and pass on as an attribute to the policy server. Now, when you write your authorization policies, when you write your ABAC policies, you're going to determine who the actor is. Are we dealing with a doctor? Are we dealing with a patient? Are we dealing with an insurance agent? And we're also going to determine what data we're handling. Is it a medical record or is it a journal? And based on that, we're going to write our different policies. Example, a doctor can view the medical record of a patient they have a relationship to. What the API gateway will do is extract the user ID, Bob, extract the fact that we're trying to access a medical record, okay? Extract the ID of that medical record and send on the authorization request to the policy server and ask, can Bob view medical record 123? And if we look at the policies that the policy server has been configured with, typical example, and these are HL7 examples, a physician can view the medical journal of a patient he or she is assigned to, number one. Number two, a patient can view their own medical journal. And lastly, a patient can view the journal of patients who are the legal guardian for. So there's a delegation, proxy-delegate relationship here. And in the example I was mentioning before, can Dr. Bob view medical record 123? The policy server receives that question. The policy server will fetch the owner of medical record 123 through the backend attribute sources, and we'll figure out that the record in this example belongs to Alice. And then we'll check whether Alice is assigned to Bob, whether Bob is Alice's assigned physician. And if it is the case, the policy evaluation will result in a permit, and that permit will be returned back to the CAPI gateway, which will enforce the decision and pass it on to the backend service to retrieve that medical record. And to wrap it up and leave some time for a Q&A, I just want to mention an example that we had a few years back with an insurance company in Switzerland. They happen to be the largest health insurance provider in Switzerland with 2 million customers, or just under 2 million customers, for a population, I believe, in Switzerland of about 10 million. And what they did is really interesting, and that's a trend we see a lot with insurance companies, with retail banks as well, where you have a traditional brick-and-mortar business that wants to open up to the internet, open up to new experiences, to new technologies, and provide better services to their customers and their partners. And for instance, providing the ability to connect to data from a mobile device. And in their case, they were building an invoicing system on the one hand, as well as a customer and business portal on the other hand. And what they had to do was exchange rich information with their partners, with health insurers, other health insurers, and with medical actors, hospitals, doctors, and they had to do that in a very efficient way. However, historically, the sources of data, the medical records, they were locked up in a backend database in an obscure corner of the enterprise that database could not be directly exposed to the outside world. That would have been a threat. So what they did instead is use an API gateway. They used the, back then it was called the Layer 7 API gateway, which is now the C API gateway. They exposed their data through that API. They defined they created a well-defined API and methods on that API to expose the data to external consumers of that data, the partners and the customers. And in order to make sure that only the relevant users got access to the right information under the right circumstances, they extended the C API gateway with the Axiomatics policy server for the fine-grained authorization decisions. The customer portal was very similar. They had a traditional web portal. They wanted to extend that to a more dynamic portal, so they added the mobile-enabled portal, and they used that based on APIs. Again, that allows for them to grow more easily their portal functionality. And once more, they used the C API gateway, and they did the fine-grained authorization using the Axiomatics policy server. And on that note, Andre, I'll hand it over to you for a Q&A.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Anderson, for a great session on APIs and where we're headed with this more flexible and dynamic approach to protecting applications and protecting data as well. Since this is a recorded session, you can find a Q&A on our website in the resource webinar section. Thank you for joining us, and we'll hope to see you next time. Bye for now.